There's one set of oil colors that I use for anything and everything. Whether I'm painting the Swiss Alps or Greek ruins, red rocks or crashing waves or quiet ponds, or even the occasional still life of a portrait, I'm constantly using the same palette. Today I have my palette box here and I'm gonna walk you guys through each one of these colors, the logic behind my palette and how I use my palette to be able to paint any color that I see quickly and efficiently. A little bit about the color theory and the choices behind my palette. And I'm also gonna talk a little bit about some of my considerations for these choices. What should you know? What should you look for when choosing oil colors? Last but not least, I'm going to talk about some of the specific relationships and specific reasons I may have chosen these colors over others, and some of my go-to mixtures for most of my paintings, because oftentimes I reach for the same colors over and over again. But without any further ado, let's get into the actual palette. So here, I always have a white. Most of the time that's titanium white, some of the time that's lead. Don't recommend it if you're a beginner. So let's say titanium white, cadmium yellow light, cadmium yellow medium, cadmium orange, cadmium red, quinacridone magenta, ultramarine blue, cobalt blue, viridian, ivory black, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, and mud. This is just the scrapings of my palette put off into the little corner. Sometimes it's useful. Can't buy it in a tube. So what is the basic idea behind this palette? Well, the basic idea behind this palette is that it is an extended primary palette. This palette is working on the color theory of the primary colors, how you mix any primary color together. You get your secondary colors and your tertiary colors, and you can basically mix any color with one of the three primaries, yellow, red, or blue, traditionally. I have a warm and a cool of each primary, our yellows, our reds, and our blues, and then I also have an earth primary. So a yellow ochre is obvious, but then burnt sienna, that serves as an earth red. Ivory black serves as an earth blue, actually. It's not black, it's blue if you're using it for its color's sake. So let me do a little demonstration on my palette and get into some of that. So I'm gonna start with yellow up here. And so between these two yellows, this yellow leans slightly orangish, this yellow leans slightly greenish. The terms warm and cool can be a little confusing. Typically, what people refer to as warm leans towards orange, and what people refer to as cool leans towards blue. It can be a bit more intuitive way of seeing and feeling color. Other people prefer to talk about colors only by hue, so they would refer to these yellows not as a warm and a cool yellow, which I would say this is the warm yellow, this is the cool yellow, but as an orangish yellow or a greenish yellow. So we have our yellows, we also have reds. So I have my cadmium red and I have my quinacridone. And then we also have our blues. So I have a cobalt blue, which is a bit more of a greenish blue. When we talk about the color temperature of blue, some people refer to cobalt blue as true blue, but I'll get to why I have cobalt blue and not another blue on my palette. And then we also have ultramarine. So let me grab a brush and spread these out and show you guys what I mean by color wheel. I'm going to just grab a little sable and start blending some of these colors. And so obviously we all know that yellow and blue mix green. And depending on how much yellow we have or how much blue, they can mix different shades of green. And now there's a little bit of a gradient from cobalt into ultramarine. And then that ultramarine turns into quinacridone. And from quinacridone, cadmium red. And last but not least, we get our oranges by mixing a little bit of yellow and cad red light. So these are basically our primary colors. The reason I like having two chromatic primaries instead of just one is because I find that you get brighter extremes, you get more range by just using one set of the chromatic primaries, just one bright blue, yellow, and red. You're going to miss some of the range on the extent of here. Now that I've got this going, let me talk a little bit about complementary colors. Complementary colors are usually a primary color and a secondary color. On the color wheel, colors that are opposites are considered complementary. And we know that because by mixing them together, they neutralize and turn into a chromatic gray. Reaching for a little bit of cobalt blue and an orange. So I usually have a little orange here, but this orange I've mixed. One of the reasons I like to have an orange, by the way, you can see the orange out of the tube is brighter than the orange that we can mix from our cad red light and our cadmium yellow medium. But mixing orange and cobalt blue neutralizes those colors. You could take this further also by taking our violet, our purple, that is mixed from ultramarine blue. If we mix that against a yellow, it also neutralizes. And then lastly, mixing greens into reds also neutralize. Either by taking our yellows and our purples, or our oranges and our blues, or our greens and our reds, we're able to mix across the color wheel to be able to neutralize whatever color that we're seeing. The other thing that is very important to consider is what actually makes up color. When I'm mixing color, I'm constantly thinking about hue, saturation, and value. The actual color that it is, the colorfulness of the color, and then the lightness or brightness of that color. So the hue is actually the color of the color. It's the redness or the greenness or the blueness or whatever of that color. The saturation, how colorful is that color? How pure is that color, or how gray is that color? In the color wheel, something ideally that is in towards the center neutralizes into a perfect gray. And the last part of color, part of the reason why I have both titanium white and ivory black, because that is the limit of our color space in oil paints. The last bit of color is the value. There are really complex color systems that I think are overly confusing out there, like the Munsell system. It's important to understand the color space, how white and black is at the top, and then different colors, their purest extremes at different values. So your yellows are brighter than your greens, and much more so than your blues or your violets, but it's important not to get too overly confused by that. Now, the other thing about this color wheel is that I'm constantly thinking about mixing across the color wheel. So if I'm mixing a green on this color wheel, I have a few options. I have a few different yellows and a few different blues. If I take my greenish yellow and my greenish blue, or my cadmium yellow light, or my cobalt blue, I'm going to mix across this color wheel, and I'm going to get a much more greenish green, rather than if I was using ultramarine blue and cadmium yellow medium. Because ultramarine blue is a reddish blue and cad yellow medium is more orangish or reddish yellow, that's going to be a less pure green mixture from those two colors. Now, how do the earth colors fit in the earth primaries? Ivory black, when we mix it with just a little bit of titanium, we see that it starts to get a really cool gray. Sometimes, depending on how much white, this gray is almost the perfect color for an overcast sky. That's why I like it. And then obviously our burnt sienna and yellow ochre are self-explanatory. These colors exist somewhere here in the middle. Burnt sienna is a orangish red that is fairly muted. It exists somewhere here in the middle. Yellow ochre leans much more yellow and it's a bit more chromatic. And then our ivory black, it does exist a lot closer in the middle. Ivory black mixed with any of these yellows will mix something that functionally looks like a green, but it'll be pretty desaturated. And that's a color mixture that I like to use a lot, but more on that in a bit. So a recap thus far. This is a extended primary palette. I have a warm and a cool of each chromatic primary and an earth primary. And for a few reasons, I also have cadmium orange and viridian. It's important to understand what your primary colors are, how you mix those to make your secondary colors, but also your complementary colors to how to neutralize a color that you see. Oftentimes I may look at a color and ask myself, is this color too red or too green? And then I reach for the complement to pull it back. So if I'm mixing a landscape, if I have a lot of greens, oftentimes I can reach for a red to neutralize those greens if the greens that I'm mixing are way too pure. If I am out in a city center painting some stone, some architecture, oftentimes I can accidentally make mixtures too warm, meaning they are too red or too orange. So even though I want to paint stone, I'm reaching for my blues or my greens to neutralize that. And when I want to mix a color efficiently, I don't always choose a random primary, but I choose a primary that will get me to that mixture as fast as possible. And within this palette, there are also some limited palettes. When I was at the academy, they started us with just a grisaille, just a monotone painting, so white and a black, but then they moved us on to what's commonly called a Zorn palette, which is usually a white and a black, bright red, and a earth yellow, usually yellow ochre. Nowadays, usually a cadmium red. Back in the day, it used to be a vermilion. I have those colors on my palette should I need them. I don't use every single color for every single painting, but I find that having these colors makes my life and my painting process so much simpler, because I'm never left wanting. I'm never fighting my colors, trying to mix a muted tone for minutes on end with these really bright and powerful colors that just keep bouncing around from chromatic to chromatic gray. So what are some of the main considerations when I was settling on these colors? Why these colors? Why not other colors? The basic logic underpinning it is that it is an expanded primary, but there are other paints out there that could also fit the bill. The first thing about all of these colors is that they are single pigment colors. When you go to the art store and you look at all these paints, there are a lot of paint tubes up on there, but some of those paint tubes are actually mixtures of multiple pigments. All of the colors that I have are pure pigments, meaning they aren't mixed with any other pigments. It's just one color. I have a preference for single pigment colors because they are at their most pure, and I'm already going to be mixing them into everything else, so I want to have the purest color out of the tube that I possibly can. Another big consideration for these colors is they're mostly all fairly historic and safe. So I was looking at pigments that have been in use for a very long time and by some of my favorite painters. Throughout history, there's always been a worry about oil painting colors because not all colors artists used lasted over time. And when I'm picking out colors, I want to know that they're going to last. One of the ways to do this is if you look on the back of most any tubes of oil paint, you can see the light fastness or the permanence rating. And so generally I'm picking very light fast or very permanent colors. There's one color on my palette that is relatively modern. I think it's under a century old. That would be quinacridone magenta. Now, the reason I have quinacridone magenta is it actually is a fill-in for what would traditionally be alizarin. Alizarin has a lot of problems with light fastness and it fades over time, but as far as we know, quinacridone, it's been around since the mid-century and it's been pretty good so far. In the past, artists tried all these different colors like bitumen or smalt, and those had real problems with longevity of the painting, and so it's very important to pick colors that you know your painting is going to last, so avoid the colors that aren't light fast. Another thing about all of these colors is they're all relatively opaque. That reflects partly my painting style. Some people, when using oil paints, they appreciate the transparent nature that you can get from some colors. I tend to avoid working transparently because it often requires using some kind of paint thinner, and also, perhaps more importantly, glazes, paintings done transparently, they photograph really, really poorly. So I find it annoying, and I much rather just make paintings with opaque paint. You might see other people have specific colors on their palette because of their transparent nature and because they can use them in glazes. Not something that I have on my palette, but something you should know about. The next consideration is drying time. There are some paints that I used to use, like raw umber or Prussian blue, which I no longer use anymore, mostly because I found them drying way too fast. I'm painting a lot en plein air, meaning I'm painting outside. Sometimes the sun is beaming down right on me and on my palette. There are certain colors that dry much faster than others, raw umber and Prussian blue being some of the fastest drying colors that I've ever tried. For me, it was a real issue if my paint was drying on my palette, on my mixing area, over the course of maybe just 2 hours. So I'm making sure none of my paints are drying too fast. Now the last thing, one of the most important parts of the oil paint, aside from its pigment, is its binder. And its binder is what the particles of pigment, what the little colored powder is actually suspended in. And now this is different from acrylic or gouache because those are gum arabic or plastic binding. Oil binding is oil, it's plant oil. And there are a few options. to oil paint, I specifically try to buy paint with mostly linseed oil, sometimes walnut oil for my lead white, because walnut lead white dries a lot slower than a linseed oil white, but oftentimes I am reaching for linseed oil bound oil paints instead of walnut or safflower or poppy, because linseed oil is the most archival. It has the greatest longevity out of the oils. Some of the other paint films are a little bit more brittle. Finally, let me talk about some of the relationships between these colors and why I picked these colors over others. So I think one of the most controversial colors that I actually have on my palette that a lot of landscape painters might have very strong opinions on is actually ivory black. So a lot of people say that you should never use black in a landscape painting. There's a little bit of truth to this, but that truth can often be misunderstood and overly dogmatized. I obviously do use black on my palette when I am out landscape painting, but the important distinction to make is I'm not using black to mix my shadows. If you are using black and just adding black to a color mixture, that's not actually the way to mix a shadow. The shadows and the lights are oftentimes entirely separate colors. It's also very important to mix your shadows to be fairly chromatic. So what I actually use black for is I actually use black as a blue to mix my greens. This is something I am pretty certain I've seen in paintings of some of my favorite painters like Isaac Leviton, possibly Ivan Shishkin. But having black on my palette allows me to take this black, mix it with either of my cadmium yellows, and come out with a fairly muted, natural green color. Our biggest problem when mixing greens outside, especially if we're beginners, is by mixing greens that are overly chromatic, just overly reaching for yellow and blue and yellow and blue and yellow and blue. And then we have this really extreme, putrid, acidic green that doesn't actually match up with what we see in nature. I find that ivory black with either of my cadmium yellows is actually a pretty good fit for certain greens. The corollary of what I sometimes tell my students about this is don't use your black to mix your darks, use it to mix your greens. Don't use your green to mix your greens, use it to mix your darks. By that, I'm talking about the Viridian that I have on my palette. I use Viridian often as a very common base to mix some of my chromatic darks. So Viridian and quinacridone magenta is probably the darkest mixture I can mix on my palette instead of reaching for just ivory black. This is very useful when you're working outside because no colors outside are actually a pure dark, especially if we look at color by measuring it with a little circle and look through that little circle, use the shadow on the inside of the hand, compare anything. Sometimes if you're working indoors in a studio on a still life or on a portrait, you might actually see something that is just void of all light and is basically equivalent to ivory black. But you have to understand that being in that studio, you're basically stuck inside a dark little box with maybe a little window as an opening, and it's a very dark and poorly illuminated environment, as opposed to when we are outside, we are flooded with light from the sun. It's bouncing around from the sky and bouncing around everything else. So when I'm outside, I much more rather reach for those chromatic darks. I use green for that commonly. Oftentimes I'm also reaching for ultramarine blue, burnt sienna to mix my chromatic darks. Sometimes that is a very, very useful mixture. Ultramarine blue, burnt sienna with a little bit of white often gets you really close to tree bark, depending on the tree. Orange is the other color that I have that is not a primary aside from Viridian. Obviously, part of the reason is the orange, it is much more extreme and much more colorful than just a red and a yellow. I find that we really need that extreme if we're painting sunsets or sunrises. And the other thing about cadmium orange specifically on my palette that I really like, it sits right across from cobalt blue and it neutralizes perfectly when you're mixing a sky. Sometimes mixing a sky, you can mix just a little bit of white, cobalt blue, a touch of cadmium orange, and it's perfect for that little haze above the horizon. That might be another question. Why do I have cobalt blue as my second blue if it is considered largely a true blue instead of a greenish blue, like a cerulean or a Prussian? A lot of people use a cerulean blue for a split primary palette. I much prefer a cobalt blue. Cobalt blue and Viridian mixed together with a little bit of white gets you really, really close to that cerulean that I'm missing. However, I find I've tried cerulean and I haven't really liked it. And cobalt, on the other hand, has a lot of applications for the landscape. And not only that, but it has a lot of applications for the figure, for the portrait. If you look back towards artists from the 19th century, even figurative artists, you'll see many of them had cobalt blue on their palette. The other really important use for Viridian, if we're working on a portrait or a figure, Viridian often works really well with either quinacridone magenta, this more rosier, purpler red color, and I feel like I've seen that time and time again in portrait painting such as John Singer Sargent's. Oftentimes when painting flesh, it's important to get that variance between green and red undertones. And when I've looked at some of his paintings, when I've tried to recreate some of them, I find that Viridian and quinacridone magenta can get you really, really close. So if you're just using a Zorn palette and the skin is feeling a little bit dead, just adding those two colors to your Zorn palette really increases your range for your ability to paint flesh. Ivory black and the cadmium yellows are really, really great to paint some more muted natural greens, but using yellow ochre and ultramarine blue or even a little bit of cobalt blue is also another way to get a more muted, more neutral, more natural looking green rather than the ivory black and the cadmium yellows. I would say cadmium orange is maybe one of the colors I use the least of, especially when I'm painting outdoors. It's really rare that I need something that is that bright red, but I have it on my palette just in case I need it. Most of the time when I am neutralizing something with a red, instead of reaching towards cadmium red, my go-to is burnt sienna to neutralize something that is a little bit too greenish. And burnt sienna is obviously an earth red, so it works to neutralize it without accidentally overpowering it and the other way. The other thing about burnt sienna specifically, it's very important to have a burnt sienna on my palette that is fairly dark. I've noticed that there are some brands that their burnt sienna is more closer to what I would consider Venetian red, but my burnt sienna, you can tell how dark it is. If it wasn't that dark, you would need to substitute it with a transparent red oxide maybe. Transparent red oxides seem to be a bit more consistent. I used to have raw sienna or Venetian red or one of the umbers, raw umber or burnt umber, but I find that most of those earth colors are a gradient anyway between these colors. Burnt umber or raw umber sit fairly in between the burnt sienna and the ivory black. They might have a little bit of a hue difference, and raw sienna or Venetian red sits fairly in between the yellow ochre and the burnt sienna. I find that I don't really need those colors if I have these, and I could tweak things a little bit with these chromatic reds if I need to access that color. So that's my palette at a glance. If you want to see it in action, I have a bunch of videos here on this channel. I also have a Patreon where I have long format, more exclusive tutorials on there. And if you ever want to study with me in person, I have a workshop mailing list. So I do some workshops throughout the year, sometimes in Europe, sometimes here back home in the US. Sign up to the mailing list so you don't miss any news from there. Thanks for watching, guys, and hopefully see you in the next one.